work in Stony Brook, New York, and Long Island, and I'm a professor in the Department of Neurosurgery here, and I am the director of the residency training program here. So I train the young neurosurgeons, and my specialty within neurosurgery is pediatric neurosurgery. So I've been doing that for many years. I started out my life as an atheist, and I was raised in upstate New York. I realized as I looked further into the neuroscience, into Wilder Penfield's work, into research on epilepsy and on awake brain surgery and my own experiences with that, research on split brain surgery, research on near-death experiences. There are all sorts of fascinating science there. I realized that the materialist bias in the scientific community was leading us astray. It was really betraying real science. And I also realized that you can't get away from philosophy. That is, that every endeavor in life, science is one good example, presupposes a philosophical framework, a way of understanding how the world works. And that scientists who claim, oh no, we're just doing science, we're not doing philosophy, it's not true. What you're doing is materialism and atheism hidden in your science. So I really started to look at the philosophy in a much deeper way. And I read quite a bit of Aristotle and Plato, and I became very interested in Thomistic philosophy from St. Thomas Aquinas. And there's an author named Ed Feser, who's a philosopher in California, who's written a great deal on this, F-E-S-E-R, his last name, who gives a wonderful introduction to this way of looking at things. And I realized that particularly Thomistic philosophy, which is the cornerstone of a lot of Christian theology and philosophy, explains science in a beautiful way. He explains neuroscience. He worked in the 13th century, and his perspective on the mind-brain relationship is much, much closer to what we've discovered in modern neuroscience than any materialistic perspective. So I realized that you had to get the philosophy into this. You had to get your philosophy right. If you don't have the philosophical or metaphysical framework right, you can't get the science right. When I was a college student, I worked in a research lab, and my mentor there was a professor named Bob Pollack. He was a wonderful man. Actually went on to be dean of the college, and Pollack was a molecular biologist. And he used to talk to me a lot about his philosophy of science. And one point he made, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, is he said, in science, by far the most important part of science is to ask the right question. He said, scientists tend to focus too much on the answers. But the problem is, if you haven't formulated the question right, you don't know what the answer means. So if you ask the question in a shallow kind of superficial way, the answers don't mean anything to you. So he said, so be very careful of your questions. Spend most of your time thinking about, what am I really asking here? There's a philosopher named Roger Scruton who made a comment about neuroscience that I think gets to the real heart of the problem in neuroscience, but the problem more broadly in science. And Scruton said that neuroscience is a vast collection of answers with no memory of the questions. That basically neuroscience is just philosophically illiterate. And much of science is philosophically illiterate. And when you're philosophically illiterate, you tend to become a materialist, because materialism is sort of the dumbest kind of philosophical perspective. And you just fall into this notion that, oh, the brain must be some kind of computer. I'm going to study it that way. And of course, there's no meaningful sense that one could say the brain is a computer. Certainly the mind is not a kind of computation at all. It's actually the opposite of computation. So I came to see philosophy and theology, which of course follows on philosophy, as a cornerstone in good science. Basically, you have to understand the metaphysical framework of how the world works before you can make sense of any kind of science. The first thing I think we as Christians should do is we should not give up the label of skeptic and allow atheists to be skeptics. The least skeptical people I know are atheists. They believe all kinds of nonsense and don't question it. Atheism itself is nonsense, as is materialism, And if you accept it, you're no kind of skeptic. Christians are the skeptics. We're the people who think deeply about things and who ask questions. And the greatest saints have been great skeptics. I mean, Kierkegaard pointed out that there is no higher form of faith than to struggle with God. You know, that Jacob struggled with God. Christ struggled with his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he struggled on the cross. So a real skeptic is a person who asks the real questions. Classically in theology, it's been recognized that there are two ways we come to God. One is by faith, and the other is by reason. And they work together. What I found personally is something that goes back to the scholastic theologians, is that it's best in some sense to begin with faith. It's best to begin by opening yourself up to God. And the reason part comes, that is that in my view, God's existence and the characteristics that we ascribe to him of omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence is a scientific theory. I very much believe that's a scientific theory, just like the Big Bang is a scientific theory, just like relativity is a scientific theory. It's a scientific theory in the sense that it's a claim about reality for which we can have evidence. And in my view, God's existence and knowing about God is the most thoroughly proven scientific theory there is. The two ways or actually three, that I find personally most compelling, besides Aquinas' five ways. The first was St. Augustine's way. And what Augustine said was that universal concepts like love and justice and goodness and things like that clearly exist. It clearly is. Love is something real, and justice is something real, and goodness is something real. But it's not in anything in the physical world. I can't pick up a cup of justice and show you how much justice I have in this cup, but it's real. It's darned real, and we can't evade that. And Aquinas says what's real about it is that they're thoughts in God's mind. The reality of it is that we are thoughts in God's mind. The entire universe is a thought in God's mind. That anytime, if you take universal concepts realistically, if you acknowledge, which you have to if you're realistic, that, yeah, they are real. Well, what's real about them is they're God's thoughts, and we have the privilege of participating in those thoughts. So that's one way of looking at it. The other proof is a proof of Gottfried Leibniz, who was a great scientist and mathematician back in the scientific revolution, who proposed what he called the principle of sufficient reason. And the principle of sufficient reason says that everything that happens in the world has to have a reason that accounts for it. It doesn't mean that you know the reason. Most things we don't know the reasons. But it makes no sense to say something happens for no reason. And if we accept that the universe happens for no reason, we can't do science. If we say that the universe doesn't have any reason for being the way it is, well, then why would we look for reasons anywhere? If you say the universe just exists for no reason, then why can't you say that a particular animal just exists for no reason, so you can do away with Darwinian evolution? Or why wouldn't you say that a particular atom is the way it is for no reason, so you do away with quantum mechanics? Or you can say that the universe, or that space exists like it is for no reason, so we'll do away with the theory of relativity. So you can't do science unless you accept that everything has a reason, some kind of reason. And of course, you have to say, well, then what's the reason for the universe? And that's what all men call God. So if you deny God, you're denying ultimate reasons, and you can't even do science. For me, what I think is the most powerful argument for God's existence is what I call the 10th proof. And the 10th proof is the moral law. And this was Kant's argument. Immanuel Kant made this argument. And when we think about right and wrong, there are two kinds of, you might say, good and bad. There's a good and bad that is objective. That is, it's something that we discover. It's something that's above us, that we all recognize. And there's a good and bad that's subjective, that we happen to feel. For example, I don't like peppermint ice cream. Okay, just doesn't appeal to me. I think it's kind of bad. But other people do, and there's nothing wrong with them liking it and my not liking it. It's just a matter of opinion. I also don't like torturing children. I think torturing children is bad. But torturing children is bad in a way that's different from peppermint ice cream being bad. Torturing children being bad is not just my opinion. Torturing children being bad is immoral. It's part of the moral law. And it's something that we discover, that we all know. And because the moral law is real, and it's real because we all know that certain things are wrong. Killing innocent people is wrong. Torturing people is wrong. Cheating is wrong. Lying is wrong. Stealing is wrong. And it's not just a matter of opinion. Nobody says, I think rape is a terrible thing, but you're entitled to your opinion. If you like rape, that's okay with me. I just think it's wrong. Rape is not like peppermint ice cream. It's not the same thing. So because there are objective moral standards that we can't escape, and believe me, some of the most moralistic people around are atheists and materialists. I mean, they have all kinds of strong moral viewpoints. But if you hold a strong moral viewpoint, you have to acknowledge that there's a mind outside of human minds from which those viewpoints come. The moral law has to come from somewhere. So every time I think, gee, I'll be watching TV and there's something terrible that happens. If you think, for example, about those little girls who drowned in Texas in those flash floods a few weeks ago, that was a horrible thing. But why would I think it was horrible? It wasn't my kids, it wasn't my genes, it doesn't harm me in any Darwinian way. If we were evolved by Darwinian mechanisms, the fact that other people's children would die would mean that our children would have a better chance for success in this world of competition, of spreading your genes. So in a Darwinian world of dog eat dog, of a struggle for existence, that other people's deaths should be good. We should be happy about that because we win. We didn't drown. Our kids didn't drown. But we all feel it's a tragedy. Atheists no less than Christians. Everybody's heartbroken about that. And it's because we recognize that there's an objective standard of good and evil, and that an innocent person dying like that is evil. It's bad. And it breaks our hearts too, which means that we are not Darwinian creatures. We are not evolved strictly by a process of struggle for survival. It means that we recognize that there is an external standard of good and evil. And for there to be an external standard of good and evil, there has to be a mind that holds that standard, and that is the mind of God. So I find the moral law to be inescapable proof of God's existence. Every time I see something that I think is really good, somebody who shows heroism, somebody who shows courage or kindness, every time I see something that's really bad, innocent people dying, people committing crimes, things like that, I think that proves that God exists, because I wouldn't recognize objective moral law unless there was a source for that moral law. Now, many people who are atheists doubt God's existence because of the problem of evil. They'll raise the question, oh yeah, but why would God allow things like that? And that's a fair question. That's theodicy. That's a whole branch of theology. It's a perfectly fair question. However, you're acknowledging God's existence if you ask the question. Because if you recognize that some things are objectively evil, you are recognizing objective moral law, which requires God's existence. Now, explaining it is a whole other question. I don't know why God allowed those little girls to die. I don't know. But the fact that it bothers me that they died proves God's existence, because I acknowledge good and evil. Personally, I think, and I don't claim to know the answer to the questions of theodicy, but I think that those children are with God now, and that we live eternal life in His presence, which is an immeasurable blessing, and that the tragedies in our life, as terrible as they are, and I know tragedy very, very well, they are very small compared to eternity and to God's love. So I leave it to him. I say, Lord, I don't fully understand, but I